So lately, I've been doing something quite out of character and been thinking a lot about vampires. And because I've been thinking about vampires, I've been thinking about My Chemical Romance.
After a nearly 10-year hiatus and first announcing their reunion tour on the 31st of October 2019, a tour that was naturally stalled by the COVID-19 pandemic, My Chemical Romance commenced their comeback tour on the 16th of May 2022 to worldwide acclaim and fangirl frenzy. For the maybe two people in my audience who are not in the know, My Chemical Romance have been a long-standing, generally well-liked, and culturally significant band in the goth and emo music scene since their debut in 2001 with their first album, I Brought You My Bullets, You Brought Me Your Love. While easily recognised in the early 2000s by a stark, emo-esque aesthetic, a blueprint for emo's image quickly adopted by their fans, be they male or female, their discography of instant emo classics scored them several awards, nominations, critical accolade, and recognition as one of the most significant rock bands this side of the millennium.
They became especially popular, however, with teenage girls, women, and queer folks who, while drawn to it, felt left behind by other darkly inclined scenes like goth, classic emo, or punk, in which misogynistic alienation is entrenched. While existing in this sort of liminal space when it came to interacting with metal and gothic rock, abstaining in favour of what is safe, perhaps even suburban and hegemonic, while yearning for potential gothic authenticity, these fans then totally rallied behind MCR's music because of its emotional catharsis and the provided solace in the music when faced with unhappiness. Through My Chemical Romance, the woes of teenage girls, of queer people, of anyone who needs to hear it, is validated and taken seriously. People die, cars collide, you're not okay, and a plethora of other lyrics insinuate as much, but you'll carry on and survive in the end. There's emotional catharsis there, of recognising the bad, suffering and surviving through the worst, and triumphing in the end. A little like the solace provided by gothic literature or horror films, specifically for women targeted by misogynistic alienation by other genres.
Indeed, through their propensity towards emotional catharsis, as well as their deliberate association with the dark aesthetics of goth and contemporary emo that we have come to recognise as being distinctly emotional, My Chemical Romance essentially created a safe space for marginalised people through their music, and put their voices, safety, and yes, marketing tastes, at the forefront of their musical brand. Where other bands in the scene were getting exposed for allegations of grooming and sexual harassment, My Chemical Romance was advocating for women's safety in their concerts and, well, playing with their minority straight male audience. More on that soon.
If you ever see shitty-ass rock dudes in shitty-ass rock bands asking you to show them your tits for a backstage pass, I want you to spit right in their fucking face and yell, "Fuck you!"
As I so cleverly hinted at, and as discussed in all of my essays, women and girls are often drawn to gothic signifiers and modes of horror, whether they be in literature, cinema, music, or fashion, due to a sense of kinship and unconditional understanding not typically validated by other forms of hegemonic and mainstream media. So it's no surprise that the high gothic and horror-inspired modes of My Chemical Romance have amassed the fanbase that they have. But what does this have to do with vampires?
My Chemical Romance have always dabbled in the subversive. Pre-hiatus, they were probably best known for their notable aesthetic stylings, which were always passably gothic and arguably flamboyant, with all members donning varying levels of makeup and draggy on-stage costumes, making visible the oft-hidden possibility that all masculinity might be constructed, multiple and fluid, with spectacular potential. However, even if they were cinched to the gods and smeared with enough eyeliner to drown the crowds of Warped Tour in 2005, they were simultaneously always recognizably masculine, dressed in marching band uniforms, tailored suits, and army regalia. Now, this could be a demonstration of the inherently performative aspects of masculinity, especially in the Gothic model, and an ironic twist on icons of maleness, especially in the context of army uniforms. The image of the military uniform occupies an interesting space in queer fetish and fantasy, for example, since soldiers were, as identified by Jeffrey Schneider, particularly potent objects of male-male desire. This very eroticization constituted a potentially explosive flashpoint in the effort to win social acceptance. Indeed, it can be observed in the works of My Chemical Romance that the symbols of macho, patriarchal, male institutional violence were used as a kind of draggy costume, presenting masculinity as just as much a costume as we consider femininity to be, an idea commonplace in the world of drag and drag kings, since, as Jack Halberstam writes on female masculinity, the drag king performs masculinity, often parodically, and makes the exposure of the theatricality of masculinity into the mainstay of her act. MCR even recognises this contradiction and eroticization of this drag and played up to this idea too, engaging in homoerotic displays on stage to the delights of fujoshis globally, and playfully taunting anyone who dared to throw a slur or express disgust when the boys locked lips or rubbed against each other.
But they were all still boys, you know? Kind of campy and subversive boys, but boys nevertheless.
However, the post-2020 reunion of My Chemical Romance demonstrated an evocative and identifiable shift from the style and aesthetics they were known for before their hiatus. On the 23rd of August, during their show in Nashville, Tennessee, a politically pivotal state for criminalizing abortion in 2019 after the overturning of Roe v. Wade, MCR frontman Gerard Way performed their set in a tailored and fitted cheerleader's uniform, marking a dramatic departure from his previous and more casual stylings on stage, and designating themselves and MCR as a whole as a mainstream band willing to play with and validate concepts of not only queer sexuality and homoeroticism, but also non-binary gender performance and perhaps trans femininity in goth rock stardom.
And all of this was fab, of course, and was treated as such by the fan base and cultural critics online. But I ask again, what does this have to do with vampires?
Gerard Way is open about his love for and artistic influences developing from horror cinema and queer culture, alluding to taking inspiration from films like The Phantom of the Paradise and the Rocky Horror Picture Show, among others, and working with queer icons like Liza Minnelli in MCR's deeply transcoded banger, Mama. The overtly camp and queer nature of Way's influences is an interesting one for this essay, especially since he identified these draggy, gender-bending influences in an interview as early as 2005, only to outright dress in drag almost 20 years later. Way has also not been a stranger to alluding to or being inspired by the mythos of vampires and vampirism in the works of My Chemical Romance. Their first release single, for example, was called Vampires Will Never Hurt You, a song characterised as blending punk energy with dark themes that would later give the band a real sense of identity within the space of emo and gothic rock. This long-standing inspiration additionally culminated in Way's dressing as a Bela Lugosi-esque vampire in Los Angeles, California, complete with white face paint and a billowing cape.
Gerard Way is referencing to vampire mythos, and what we understand about the Gothic within literature and cinema not only establishes My Chemical Romance as a key case study in the space of uniting Gothic rock, goth subculture and horror cinema, but also presents a rich lens through which the figure of the distinctly Gothic vampire can be better discussed and negotiated. This connection is particularly pertinent given the profound impact of Anne Rice's declaratively queer literary works on the vampire aesthetic within goth culture, especially when Gerard Way read the first lines of her novel, Interview with a Vampire, while performing at the When We Were Young festival in Las Vegas, Nevada. And this is where I talk about the Vampire Chronicles, because, girl, I have fallen hard.
The Vampire Chronicles is a series of gothic vampire novels created by Dark Mother, gothic fujoshi, and fanfiction hater Anne Rice. With the first novel, Interview with a Vampire, being released in 1976, the series comprises of 13 books spanning from 1976 to 2018, with 2 additional new Tales of the Vampires books, and small crossovers from Rice's other series, Lives of the Mayfair Witches, also crossing over into the the leading franchise. So, needless to say, this is a hefty series.
And just to be totally upfront, because like the MCR stands, people do not play with the love of Anne Rice, I am nowhere near close to finishing this franchise, like, even slightly. But I'm kind of hoping that having so much content to read will just keep my hyperfixation flame burning.
Returning to the earlier discussion, it's no wonder that Gerard Way unofficially cited Anne Rice as a direct source of inspiration for their work, as she essentially provided a, if not the, blueprint for the distinctly gothic and goth vampire, a figure MCR embraced and embodied in their culturally defining aesthetics and the emotional core of their music and identity. Because, well, Rice's vampires are truly gothic sublime to their core, gorgeously tormented, deeply emotional, and downright sensual beings, imbued with rich romanticism, aesthetic beauty, and potent homoeroticism, exploring and toying with notions of gothic masculinity, vampiric bisexuality, and homosexual desire.
I spoke a little on the queer vampire in my last video essay on romantic cannibalism 2 decades ago, but to sum up my arguments very briefly.
As Nina Auerbach suggests, vampires are neither inhuman nor non-human nor all too human. They are simply more alive than they should be. Because they are beings that flourish as liminal figures within our cultural zeitgeist, living and dead, familiar and exotic, attractive and dangerous, they can move seamlessly and fluidly between these states of human and monster, and indeed of straight and gay, a subversive, borderline figure which problematizes the boundaries of gender and sexuality, disrupting because it exists outside the boundaries which we conceive of being. The bipolarities that enclose the heterosexist notion of being are punctured, penetrated even, and new forms of being, or beings, are imagined through desire.
Putting love, romance, sex, and sexuality right at the core of the vampiric body.
And while the historical roots of the vampire figure can certainly be problematized and criticized, given its roots in racist and anti-Semitic ideas of the other body invading English soil and penetrating English women, it remains a pivotal figure in our cultural zeitgeist, spanning hundreds of years of mythology and media globally. And while it certainly isn't lost on me that Anne Rice chose to discuss these issues through extremely handsome, white, able-bodied men, one of whom being a slave owner, it's encouraging to see the figure, and indeed the text itself, being reclaimed and reinterpreted to discuss subjects around racism, sexual assault and trauma, queerness and romance at its most gothic.
Sort of similar to what My Chemical Romance did with gothic rock machismo, reclaiming the scene within the space of subversive gender performance, homoeroticism, and the centering of women and their desires in their musical brand.
It may even have been Anne Rice who presented the vampire as being a sympathetic figure for readers to empathise with and a literary hero in the first place, since, as Kristen Bone suggests, Rice accords her vampires an unmediated voice so they can describe their friendships, losses, triumphs, and the pain they have endured watching different worlds rise and fall around them through the ages. Indeed, the Vampire Chronicles presents, in the words of the vampire Lestat himself, the morally complex, spiritually tough, aesthetically relevant, and explicitly queer vampire, consequently popularising a more empathetic approach and aesthetic focus among traditional writers and readers of vampire fiction, encouraging them to humanise their monsters and identify with the often abject, overtly queer body that vampirism can represent.
And while Rice's novels were definitely popular, it was arguably the 1994 Neil Jordan film Interview with a Vampire that further popularised this more elegant, brooding portrayal of vampiric masculinity and firmly cemented the Anne Rice vampire as a significant goth cultural symbol. But I'm not here to talk about the 1994 movie. I'm not even here to talk about the series. I am going to talk about Queen of the Damned.
Queen of the Damned, adapted for the screen by Scott Abbott and Michael Petroni and directed by Michael Reimer, were released in 2002 by Warner Brothers Pictures and served as an indirect adaptation of the second and third books in Anne Rice's The Vampire Chronicles series, from which the film took its name. The film follows the ancient vampire Lestat de Lioncourt after he awakens from a centuries-long sleep and decides to reveal himself to the world by becoming a provocative and wildly successful rock star. star. His music then inadvertently wakens the mother of all vampires, Akasha, played by the, at the time, hugely successful pop star Alia, who intends to make Lestat her consort and together dominate or destroy humanity. Despite the film's reputation for being narratively uneven, and that's putting it pretty kindly, and achieving notorious status after Anne Rice publicly disavowed the production, in spite of how centralised her name was in the marketing campaign, Queen of the Damned's unique gothic aesthetic and its audacious commitment to early 2000s B-movie absurdity have cemented its place as a quintessential cult favourite among horror enthusiasts. And me. And its initial theatrical run performed respectably at the box office, likely due in part to Alia's casting, thereby mitigating any financial disaster.
Also, fun fact, if we didn't have Queen of the Damned, we wouldn't have Sam Reid as Lestat in AMC's Vampire Chronicles series. Like, he saw Queen of the Damned and loved it so much, he decided to become Lestat. So everyone say thank you to Queen of the Damned for Sam Reid as Lestat and nothing else. Well, not nothing else. You'll see what else.
As previously established in the case study of My Chemical Romance, and according to J. Gordon Melton, the vampire has functioned as the single most appropriate image for the goth subculture, driven by a shared fascination with darkness, romanticism, the macabre, and the representation of otherness and abject or queered personhood. Nancy Gagnier additionally observes that goth subculture in particular has appropriated the signs and symbols of vampirism to create a place within which mainstream culture can produce a sympathetic monster, and explicitly cites the Vampire Chronicles novels and gothic rock of the late 1970s as examples of such appropriation.
This perhaps suggests that goth, and indeed the Hollywood gothic horror film, softened the initial edges of vampire literature, since she cites Dracula as her key case study that was transformed from alien villain to alienated victim through gothic appropriation. But again, when Dracula is so rooted in concepts of anti-Semitism and xenophobia, I think positioning the vampire as sympathetic, or at the very least, understandable and identifiable, aligns gothic horror as a genre rooted in abject identification.
While Anne Rice's novels arguably established a distinct philosophical and emotional link between the figure of the aristocratic vampire and the modern and therefore queer goth subculture, I would argue that Queen of the Damned took this connection from subtext to the main stage. Dumb text, if you will, acting as a bold, if controversial, cinematic realization of the ultimate goth vampire archetype. Therefore, this essay will examine the cinematic portrayal of the gothic vampire in Queen of the Damned, analysing how the vampire figure, with its inherent themes of transgression and abject personhood, is utilised as a vehicle to explore, normalise, and even celebrate goth aesthetics, subversive gender dynamics and performance, and pure, anti-conventional morality.
Now first, you know him, you love him, maybe you hate him, but you can't deny that he's an icon. Let's talk about Lestat.
Even outside of the context of Queen of the Damned, the character of Lestat de Lioncourt, the diva, the princess, the brat prince, and protagonist of most of the Vampire Chronicles, is a pretty significant figure of the male vampire archetype, romping through the centuries in immaculate period costume before outing himself as a leader of a vampire rock band in the late 20th century. Lestat was originally cinematically characterized by Tom Cruise's manic acting style in the Interview movie, and physically represented in the period-appropriate gothic regalia of his companion, Louis, initially played by Brad Pitt. However, since then, Lestat has only developed further as a character, embodied by the feline charm and goth grandeur of Stuart Townsend in Queen of the Damned, the domineering, phantom-like dramatics of Hugh Pinero in Lestat the Musical, and the absolutely flawless and show-stopping depth and grace and sexuality of Sam Reid in AMC's Interview with a Vampire.
Is it clear I have a favourite? What I find most interesting about Lestat's endurance is that Lestat wasn't just Anne Rice's character, but sort of an embodiment of the love she had for her husband, Stan Rice. They have the same physical characteristics, tall, blonde hair, feline grace, and the same birthday. And in a 2003 interview with her actual son, Rice noted that the character had also taken on some of her own attributes too, stating,
"Stan was Lestat. He was the inspiration. Perhaps it is best to say Lestat was Stan and me. He was Stan, and what Stan taught me. Lestat was inspired by Stan, and then I became Lestat.
Like, I know both of them were, like, insanely difficult people, but I feel like that's such a standout example of the enduring romanticism and sweetness that can be found in Gothic lit, and I don't know, Lestat's continued endurance, spreading the love that Stan and Anne had for each other is... it just makes my heart hurt, okay? It's so sweet. Ugh, moving on.
Looking at Queen of the Damned, much like the novel before it, albeit substantially different in terms of representing goth subgroups and aesthetics, the film opens with Lestat breaking out of his coffin to the sound of the then contemporary nu metal music, with the film's subsequent score and soundtrack being largely created by Jonathan Davis, the lead singer of the then popular, and still pretty popular, nu metal band, Korn. To contextualise the significance of this, well, sort of genre evolution for the once aristocratic vampire Lestat, nu metal, emerging as a post-punk grunge subgenre in the 1990s, was characterised by a, at the time, contemporary taste and musical emphasis on drums, bass, some rap, taking the influence of 90s hip-hop into the space of metal and gothic rock, rhythmic pulse and lyrics reflecting everyday stresses, connecting it stylistically to gothic literature and rock of the past, but also political messages, especially through bands like System of a Down. The influence of shock rock and horror-themed artists such as Rammstein and Marilyn Manson strengthened the connection between nu metal and rock music, with horror signifiers even further, and Manson's presence alongside other prominent nu metal acts, Linkin Park, Deftones, Papa Roach and Disturbed, amongst others, on the Queen of the Damned soundtrack, further blurred the boundaries between nu metal, contemporary goth, and historic gothic aesthetics, prompting discourse on the validity of nu and industrial metal within the goth sphere.
Nu metal has been hailed retroactively as an innovation of the metal form, filling a vacuum of mainstream heavy music styles following the outrageousness of 1980s popular metal. But at the time, it was kind of universally hated, with critics calling bands like Deftones, Machine Head, and Korn one of metal's more unfortunate pushes into the mainstream, and a dumbed-down and thankfully short-lived exercise. Woof. Similar hatred was thrown towards My Chemical Romance, of course, too, since they were quickly deemed earnest and dramatic in a way that made them conspicuously uncool and cringeworthy, producing whiny emo crap which is not punk rock and never has been. I don't think My Chemical Romance were ever trying to be punk rock, like, I don't know what the criticism is there. And naturally, hate towards the Anne Rice pretty boy vampire is abundant, manifesting in all manners of thinly veiled misogyny and homophobia. You know, sometimes these guys say that they hate the mainstream, but I think they just hate whatever makes their thing accessible and appealing to women. Hot guys.
Or guys willing to deconstruct, criticize, or parody patriarchal forms of masculinity, and center the voices, enjoyment, and purchasing power of women in their work. Which isn't to say that that's a more ethical mode of marketing and capitalism by any means. I'm not here advocating for the marketing juggernaut of female pop celebrity, for example, but understanding the market of the female consumer does a lot with regards to appealing to the mainstream. I mean, just think about your friend who buys every Taylor Swift album, or every Hatsune Miku figure, or sinks hundreds of dollars into a gacha game because the girls are cute. You know who you are.
Returning to Lestat, Catherine Spooner writes on the Queen of the Damned novel, Lestat single-handedly converts the counterculture from post-hippie rock and metal to vampire fans emulating his own gestures, much like how nu metal converted the symphonics of metal through the sound of 1990s hip-hop and industrial rock, or how My Chemical Romance existed in the space of emo and goth, and converted it through their dramatic aesthetics. Through this, Lestat might therefore represent a form of goth that goes against the mainstream and observably male nature to gatekeep the subculture from newbies, baby bats as they are occasionally called online, bringing to mind the well-established connection of gothness with vampirism even further. The camaraderie between Lestat and the baby bats and his fan base is only emphasised further in the Vampire Lestat novel and Lestat's road to goth rock stardom, in which he waxes poetic about his mortal fans with all manners of fondness.
A regular freak show of theatrical types. Punk youngsters, artists, those done up in black capes and white plastic fangs. This was a human experience made vampiric, as the music itself was vampiric, as the images of the video filmed were the images of the blood swoon.
This fondness has also been hinted at in teasers and trailers for the upcoming third season of AMC's Interview, making it a considered aspect of Lestat's character that cannot go ignored. He wants to share the world of the vampire with others, and doesn't care much for the rules that tell him not to. Indeed, despite a traumatic turning, a choice that was denied me, as he explains in text, Lestat consistently embraces his identity as a queer, gothic, and abject being who thrives in the liminal space between humanity and monsterhood.
Okay, so this is editing me again, and I've tried my best to avoid as much of this man as possible, but this guy is supposed to be Marius. This is what this guy is supposed to look like. Will someone get this man a wig, please?
This unapologetic self-acceptance provides the foundation for his evolution as a performer. By shifting from the theatrical vampire metal of the 1985 novel to the jagged, aggressive nu metal of the 2002 film, his music becomes a sonic manifestation of his defiance, and indeed, his growth as a character. This stylistic update is not merely a modern veneer, but one that also speaks to Lestat's character as a whole and his depth to grow. He is, after all, the perfect vampire.
Amidst its standing as an overtly goth adaptation of a distinctly gothic text, there is much that distinguishes Queen of the Damned as identifiably goth too.
For example, following his band's montage of success, a music video for the vampire Lestat song, Forsaken, scores the opening credits of the film and often plays on billboards and TV screens throughout it, featuring dark colours, Dutch angles, sharp shadows and lighting, white face paint, and everything you would expect from a horror rock artist like Lestat. It is also distinctive because its filming style deliberately replicates the German Expressionist movement, literally outright referencing films like Nosferatu and The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, a clever nod to and diegetic reference to Lestat's vampirism, while further associating the at-the-time vision of contemporary goth horror with its roots in gothic cinema. German Expressionism's influence on specifically goth and rock music videos has been seen before, for example in Bauhaus's Mask, Rob Zombie's Living Dead Girl, and Red Hot Chili Peppers' Other Side, but its inclusion in Queen of the Damned serves specifically to connect the nu metal vampire with the aesthetics of horror from the past. Additionally, by using the harsh vertical shadows of Nosferatu and a cold monochromatic palette, the in-film music video may use German Expressionism to signal Lestat's alienation and otherness from not only humanity, but from vampirism itself, proving that the movement's 100-year-old visual language remains a visual shorthand for the monstrous and distinctly liminal vampire.
And while the music is a key proponent of goth storytelling in Queen of the Damned, its visual aesthetic also contributes significantly to the film's overtly gothic aesthetic.
Lestat pays as much attention to the aesthetics of his bandmates as he does to their music, after all, with the cinematography emphasising, through rapid-fire flashing cuts, eyeliner-clad eyes, pierced nipples, and tattooed skin. Much like the fragmented aesthetics of German Expressionism, the fragmentation of the modified body into constituent parts echoes the classic Gothic trope of the broken or composite being, observed by Hilary Grimes in the works of Francis Galton, through which composite photography was the most accurate method of obtaining characteristic humans. Through this, the human body is deconstructed, disfigured almost, in a way that body modification is often pejoratively referred to, into a series of fetishized jagged parts that mirror the sharp, impossible geometry of a Caligari-esque dreamscape.
You're all so beautiful.
He then croons, making no distinction between the male and female members of the band, who all sport a similar industrial goth look, blurring the boundaries of sexuality and gender, as was done in Interview before it. Now, if it's not apparent from looking at him, Lestat is bisexual, and textually so, canonized in the very first Vampire Chronicles novels in his deliberate seeking of a male partner, and approved by Anne Rice herself.
Are they all bisexual?
Yeah.
Why are they all bisexual?
My characters? Yeah. Well, I have a bisexual mind. I see things bisexually.
Yeah.
In the cinematic vampire, bisexual potentialities abound. Examined as early as George Gordon Byron's unfinished novella, A Fragment, and in the novel it inspired, John Polidori's The Vampire, all connecting back to the famously promiscuous and tragically iconic Lord Byron, who enjoyed relationships with both women and men. Kind of a Lestat of his time, if you ask me. The same can indeed be said about the goth subculture, since the mainstream recognition that goth is perceived as queer in general, that is, deviant of heteronormative notions of identity, inspires many goths to celebrate the subculture's inclusiveness of a broad range of sexual identities. So it's really no wonder that the two figures overlap and intersect as often as they do.
Almost every goth is gay.
You think?
Yeah, I know.
How come they don't go to the clubs?
They go to goth clubs.
Oh.
And guess what? Goth clubs there's a lot of bisexuality.
Oh, so it's not even interesting.
It's not interesting to be gay. Not interesting to be gay in goth.
Learning from his friends, bandmates, children, Lestat adopts to his new modern landscape quickly and dresses in all manners of overtly camp and goth regalia influenced by the fashions and stylings of the French Revolution, a clash of Rococo's frivolity with the gloom of medieval barbarity, high-heeled boots and leather jackets, velvet shirts riddled with grommets and metal, black mesh and PVC, all while his face is painted white and his eyes are smeared with liberal amounts of eyeliner and cowl. This results in a distinct lack of delineation between gender expressions, similar to what Infeud did with period garb and Victorian fashion, thereby positioning the two as part of the same long lineage of aestheticized Gothic masculinity. There is also something to be said about Stuart Townsend's performance as Lestat, and how he, while always positioned in the space of heterosexual coupling, emanates a specific queer aesthetic, evident in the MCR Boys' performative approach to men and the masculine, and arguably even replicates a form of feminine aesthetic that one might associate in the space of gender bending and transfemininity. For example, during his concert in Death Valley, after throwing himself around the stage during Slept So Long, trauma dumping, crooning, and thrusting his hips, as he sings about his traumatic turning and glowers at the audience full of capes and pitchforks, he struts confidently to the very front of it with his chest forward and his head thrown back to "Not Meant for Me," taunting the vampires in the crowd waiting to pounce on him for breaking the rules and not behaving as a man, vampire should be. It naturally brings to mind the pomp of the Gothic frontman, exuding constructed confidence and unfuckable masculinity, whether ironically or not. But it also reads as a kind of draggy performance, associating Lestat with a conscious queer and some kind of feminine coding that fans have picked up on and latched onto, especially in the context of the AMC series. And by fans, I mean me. Just look at her and tell me she wouldn't kill on Drag Race. As well as this, through the film, the camera deliberately frames Lestat through an androgynous, arguably fashion-forward lens that subverts traditional masculine tropes in favour of a more glam rock feminine aesthetic. By utilising tight close-ups and fetishistic slow-motion pans, and framing Lestat as a passive object, lying down, reclining over a set of speakers, literally chained to a bed, what have you, the cinematography adopts a sort of reversed male gaze that treats Lestat's physique and facial features as objects of Gothic aesthetic beauty rather than symbols of raw power traditionally seen in other vampire films, such as Blade or Underworld. This is further emphasized through glamour lighting, specifically rim lighting, that creates an ethereal, angelic glow, and a passive staging style borrowed from early 2000s music videos, of which the cinematography was inspired, where the camera lingers on his posing and movements. Additionally, many of the film's extras are also seen donned in typical goth fashion, fishnets, black lipstick, teased hair, and more, since allegedly over 3,000 goths were recruited from Melbourne nightclubs and over the internet to occupy the clubs and stadiums where the Vampire Lestat play. And hey look, a Jonathan Davis cameo! This movie was very aware of what it was doing, if nothing else.
The very nature of Lestat performing in these venues and clubs, and indeed of extras being recruited from such clubs, brings about an interesting intersection of horror cinema of the period and goth aesthetics too.
Embodied in films like the earlier cited Blade, Underworld, and others, the Gothic nightclub functions as an interesting space in goth horror movies, and indeed other forms of media at the time, namely for its suggestion of queer and sexual transgression, mirroring the narrative potential for liberation inherent in vampirism and horror. This environment intentionally opposes normative society by accommodating identities and desires traditionally deemed as deviant, as evidenced by the permissible adoption of gender fluidity and androgyny within the goth subculture.
There is also a sense of relief in being able to shrug off one's normative identity and exist outside of the boundaries of regular society. Goth clubs allow office workers to get in touch with their darker side. Fetish clubs let people with unique tastes or relationships express themselves freely. And gay clubs can be the one space where closeted or even just not openly gay clientele can exist in the space of queerness. Imagine how that must feel to a vampire who arguably encapsulates all three.
However, this oppositional setting also allows the vampire, and indeed the supernatural at large, to blend seamlessly into a high contrast style that became a definitive visual signature of early 2000s goth horror films. Perhaps in opposition to a traditionally gothic church or religious setting, sanctified spaces where both vampires and queer bodies have historically been cast out, these films utilize the gothic nightclub as a cinematic crucible. Here, the vampire's presence is not only less conspicuous, but also visually reinforced by an aesthetic defined by black leather, vinyl, and metal accessories, which also serve as a quick visual shorthand for goth and gothic aesthetics.
It's like you say all vampires are gay as a bit, and then the deeper you go, the more you're just proven right again and again. Consequently, the club functions as a space of inverted normalcy. There is a firm visual signifier for that which is abject, the vampire, who, semi-ironically, is the traditional clientele and the norm of this subcultural environment. In this hyper-stylized landscape, it is the human who becomes the alien. The unadorned normative body is rendered as the thing that does not belong, a pale intrusion into a space where the monstrous is the only recognized standard of beauty. Just like how you weren't allowed to go into a goth club if you weren't wearing black.
This idea is even represented in Queen of the Damned, where its secondary and easily, largely, and preferably ignored protagonist Jesse researches and visits a vampire club called the Admiral's Arms, which hosts its own distinctly goth and strictly vampire clientele who pose an imminent threat to her. Despite this, Jessie does blend in somewhat seamlessly with the vampires while donned in semi-goth fashion, managing to convince the bouncer of her vampiric status, and is only literally sniffed out when her turning story fails to convince a lecherous group of vampires who proceed to attack her. Before Lestat saves her anyway.
Jessie really was the YN of the Vampire Chronicles in this movie. Maybe that's why we all hate her. Because we are her.
In Queen of the Damned, Lestat finds solace and the sense of community he craves amongst the goth who he plays with, who attend his shows, who worship his rendition of abject queered monstrosity and masculinity. His potent music, explicitly described as having a supernatural resonance that calls to other immortals, inadvertently awakens Akasha, the original and most powerful vampire queen and mother of all vampires.
For being such a divisive and structurally lacking film, Queen of the Damned also has a lot to say regarding goth gender performance and the performative nature of gender expression as a whole.
While the goth masculine is almost exclusively embodied by the draggy pomp and confidence of Townsend's Lestat, the character of Akasha and her portrayal by Alia represents a vision of goth femininity that has led the film to go down in history, without anyone actually watching it.
In my last feedback session with my PhD supervisors, my one supervisor, who's like the anti-horror rom-com feminism scholar of the two, told me she'd never seen or heard of Queen of the Damned, the film, but knew Alia was in it and who Akasha was. So that just goes to show the significance of her casting.
To contextualize for anyone younger than me or somehow less cool, Alia Dana Houghton was an American singer commonly known as the Princess of R&B and the Queen of Urban Pop. Though her life was cut tragically short by her death in 2001, leading to her feature in Queen of the Damned being a posthumous credit and the entire film being dedicated to her, she has been credited as one of R&B's most important artists and helped redefine R&B, pop and hip-hop in the 1990s, leaving an indelible imprint on the music industry as a whole and helping define the teen-oriented sound that has resulted in contemporary pop phenoms like Brandy, Christina Aguilera, and Destiny's Child.
Alia was also a massive horror and vampire fan, and she campaigned hard for this role because of her love of the original text. So it was moving to see that while Anne Rice had less than positive things to say about the film, she was so captivated by Alia's performance and so moved by stories of Black Vampire Chronicles fans feeling represented by Alia that the previously aracial Akasha became distinctly black and will be played by a black actress in the coming Queen of the Damned adaptation. I mean, she probably should have been texturally black from the beginning since she's like Egyptian and all, but I digress. And speaking of Egypt,
Akasha's visual presentation serves as a central pillar of the film's gothic semiotics, moving beyond costume and aesthetics to become a manifestation of primordial authority. Much like the sleek, high-fashion vampirism seen in The Hunger, and with all of the same queer gaze and discourse, Akasha's look is anchored by a clear nod to Egyptian mythology and royalty, a theme that has long occupied a dominant place in goth fashion and the broader vampire visual lexicon. Her ornate sculptural headdresses and metallic breastplates evoke the pharaonic as a site of absolute power, aligning Akasha with an old-world divinity that is both beautiful and terrifying, distinctly liminal and abject, effectively coding her as the mother of all vampires and placing her aesthetic at the centre of what it means to be a vampire at all. At least in this particular text.
A proclivity towards Egyptian iconography and symbolism is commonplace in goth fashion, associating the subculture with the exploration of life and death, as well as indicating a perhaps problematic desire to explore and potentially appropriate symbols from other non-normative or, well, non-white cultures. More on that soon.
She also moves through the film's world as identifiably otherworldly and abjectly out of place, perhaps even more so than Lestat is. Like Count Orlok, like Dracula, Akasha is presented as both alien and alienated, personified by Alia through slow, sensually considered gestures and movements, as if she were constantly dancing and displaying herself, fitting for the nightclub and concert settings where she kills, and also replicating the now famous goth dance moves of old goth nightclubs. This makes her appear even more visually distinct and observably feminine, while also demonstrating her power and defining her as a figure worthy of attention and worship. This much is made all the more clear when Lestat immediately submits to her upon his capture, explicitly positioning the male vampire's sexual identity within a fetishistic framework of gender subversion and power transgression.
The Vampire Chronicles navigates a lot of interesting, entirely separate essays on the family and family dynamics through the lens of vampirism. But Queen of the Damned in particular is interesting through the subversively forbidden domain of vampire motherhood and child rearing, and what that has to do with goth femininity and fetish. We're talking about fetish.
When Akasha appears before him, Lestat is immediately framed as her consort, pet, and even child, with Akasha speaking of and to him in the book, "You were born for me, my prince. I am your true mother. The mother who will never abandon you." This framing aligns with Ken Gowder's observation of Lestat as distinctly feminized, that is, rendered effeminate in the Vampire Chronicles novels through his relationship with Akasha, representing a return to the mother that seemed to disrupt gender boundaries by feminizing the son who embraces the maternal, and by lending to the mother the son's phallic power is also a path to post-feminism. While the quote is placed within the context of Lestat's romantic relationship with his actual mother, Gabrielle, who is masculinized through her vampiric turning, I think the same can certainly be suggested in Lestat's relationship to Akasha, especially through her adopting him as a sort of son, husband, slave, pet sort of thing. It is, after all, through his sensual feeding from Akasha that Lestat can survive his attempted murder in Interview with the Vampire, for example, implying that she facilitated his rebirth.
While Queen of the Damned's sexual politics are interesting, if slightly questionable if one were to linger on Anne Rice's opinions of radical feminism for too long, it does create an interesting dynamic between Akasha and Lestat, especially in the context of power dynamics.
Back to the film, where Lestat is always positioned as an object of the gaze, passive and pretty while scenes happen around him. This is especially evident in his scenes with Akasha. For example, he is often physically lower than her in frame, on his knees, being pulled build into her or outright underneath her, which places him in a traditionally feminine submissive role within the hierarchy of their relationship. By presenting the male protagonist as the submissive, visually receiving party during their lovemaking, with Akasha on top and her nudity covered, while Lestat is on the bottom and shot through composite angles of his body, panting face, closed eyes, with Akasha in full view, the film executes a sort of gender reversal that potentially aligns with the blurring of roles celebrated in the goth subculture. This scene may additionally, if subtextually, position the film as engaging with elements of BDSM and fetish practices, and the embrace of the dark side associated with goth fetish space. The subsequent scoring of the sequence with the nu metal track, Change in the House of Flies by Deftones, is another powerful cue, stylistically and lyrically reinforcing Lestat's surrender to Akasha. I took you home, set you on the glass, I pulled off your wings, and then I laughed.
If I was looking at this like a real pervert, and, well, I am, one could even contextualize this lyric in the space of not only feminization, but outright emasculation and metaphorical castration, something that Anne Rice is familiar with when considering her novel Cry to Heaven, a love story between two operatic castrati that was much more explicit about forced male feminization and gay sex than the Vampire Chronicles ever was. I also find the bisexual bathtub scene between Lestat and Akasha really interesting, because not only is Akasha instigating the entire thing, she kisses down Lestat's neck and actually sucks his blood, with lingering emphasis on his curled fists and thrown back head, pain mixed with pleasure at the literal penetration from his chest and near his nipple, potentially replicating the maternal act of breastfeeding. When contextualizing this with the previous quote on the son who embraces the maternal, Akasha feeds from Lestat as a child would from their mother and nourishes herself with his blood, just as he did to her. A lot of people like to recontextualize Anne Rice's work as the madcap ramblings of a repressed trans guy. Testosterone would have saved her and all that. But I think her interest in exploring gender nonconformity and male submission in the realms of gay and queer erotica and romance elevates her thoughts on gender a little higher than, I don't know, believing that only men could be that thoughtful about male sexuality.
I've never felt any strong gender identity myself. I've always found gender a bit confusing.
This, in line with the previous concepts of Lestat's feminization, positions Oedipal kinship between Akasha and Lestat as much more mutual and outright fetishistic, served in a way by the film's goth aesthetic and willingness to explore the boundaries of sex and gender.
However, while the narrative establishes Akasha as the original vampire queen and mother of all vampires, a being of significant power and control, her character carries significant additional weight when contextualized within the space of racial dynamics.
Akasha's obsession with Lestat, spurred by his music, sets her up as this all-powerful figure who is drawn to the spectacle of the white male celebrity, someone who is supposedly talented enough to garner worldwide acclaim and sell out stadiums while not being super talented at all. Where have I heard of that before? However, by casting a black actress in the role of the ultimate, powerful, and universally feared mother, the film inadvertently, or perhaps deliberately, introduces a subtext where the force of transgressive power and liberation, the hopeful creator of a matriarchy in the book, capable of challenging and dominating the established and largely white male vampire hierarchy, is embodied in a black female body. This casting choice forces a reading in which the film's source of radical life and death authority is distinctly racialized, positioning Akasha as an ultimate other whose power is simultaneously feared and fetishized by dominant structures, thereby aligning her with the non-conforming body as the source of ultimate power. Cressa Maeve writes on Alia's portrayal as Akasha that the image of a black woman coming to the space of her ostensible progeny, now fully colonized by a whiteness that is both fearful and unwelcoming, and burning it all down with a hungry and lustful glee, cannot be overstated, and I do think there's legitimacy to that reading. However, Rebecca Peabody observes that, despite Akasha's power, a powerful, nearly immortal, hypersexual black vampire queen is killed in a group murder by her white lover, among others. Her reign, while retroactively celebrated by the Vampire Chronicles fans as an example of racial diversity in a franchise criticised for its overt whiteness, is ultimately curtailed by a group of white heroes who must stamp out the overpowered black body, leaving the audience to question the legacy of her rebellion. While Akasha undeniably embodies a potent and destructive force, both literally and symbolically as a black woman reclaiming space from a colonised whiteness, her ultimate desires at the hands of Lestat and other white vampires reveals a complex and perhaps troubling subversion of her initial overwhelming power.
I will again say that I think Queen of the Damned's legacy of representing someone like Akasha is far more long-standing than the unfortunately problematic implications resulting from the conclusion of the film. People remember and know Queen of the Damned because of Akasha, because of Alia, because of her costume, presentation, performance, and terrific embodiment of all things gothic feminine. So while it's totally valid to have problems with the text, I think its legacy speaks more of its intention than the script ever could, because it's not a good script. It's just not.
I did this whole video just talking about Queen of the Damned, and it's not even a good film. It's not that good. It's just iconic. Iconic never meant good, all right? Ultimately, Akasha's terrifying vitality in Queen of the Damned embodies Nina Auerbach's thesis that vampires are more alive than they should be, serving as a disruptive force that dismantles rigid, heterosexist, and puritanical norms. By existing as liminal figures who problematize the boundaries of gender and sexuality, Rice's vampires offer an imaginative exploration of new forms of being through desire. This non-normativity and embrace of the abject solidified the novel's legacy as a foundational goth text, shifting the genre's focus towards a stylized, eroticized rebellion that celebrates the outsider.
Within the goth horror tradition, Queen of the Damned stands as a, however absurd, potently seminal text that helped define the modern goth aesthetic and ethos in the space of horror cinema, and moved the vampire away from the dusty ruins of the 19th century and into a neon-lit rock and roll modernity. And truly, to paraphrase the everlasting words of the vampire Lestat himself, none of us really change over time. We only become more fully what we are.